Hola, mi gente. Welcome back to the Mano a Mano podcast. I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council.
And I'm Martin Rivera, Director of Advocacy. On today's episode, we want to go over some recent and upcoming events surrounding our ongoing efforts to decolonize Puerto Rico and achieve full equality for the island.
Specifically, I'll share about a recent visit to Puerto Rico where I participated in a cross-territorial coalition that is seeking to end the unjust treatment of U.S. citizens in all 5 of America's territories and to advance democracy through decolonization. We'll also talk about an upcoming summit in Washington D.C. to advance statehood and equality for Puerto Rico.
So, let's get started. Well, George, can you tell our viewers about your recent visit to the island and the efforts of these activists in Puerto Rico and the 4 other U.S. territories?
Definitely. So actually just got back yesterday, and the event was hosted by an organization called Right to Democracy. They've been working for several years now to develop this cross-territorial coalition, which means that they've actually gone out in Puerto Rico, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and in the 3 Pacific territories, which are Guam, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa, to identify individuals that want to work together to decolonize the territories and to advance democracy there, because they understand that ultimately democracy is not just something that is important. It's actually a fundamental right for us as human beings and as Americans.
So, how did the representatives from the different territories interact with one another? And also, what different approaches were discussed and what common sense solutions were agreed upon?
You know, it's interesting because I've been part of the Puerto Rico statehood movement in one way or another over the course of the past about 20 years. And a lot of the time, we end up working together. We may have differences, but by and large, we all have a common vision for what we want for the island. And what's really fascinating about the Cross-Territorial Coalition is that it actually presents an opportunity to engage with folks from completely different ideological perspectives. So from Puerto Rico, there were other participants there who supported independence or free association. And then from the other territories, you had folks that, some want to have their residents become U.S. citizens in the case of American Samoa, because they're not U.S. citizens right now. There's something called U.S. nationals. And you had other folks that are, still very actively kind of wrestling with whether or not there's an institutional process that they could advance to increase their own democratic representation. So the interaction was one of actually a lot of listening to each other, learning about what are the things that we have as commonalities between the different territories, including our geography as islands, but also the fact that a lot of the time we feel kind of invisible and unseen at the national level. And then, a lot of the differences, obviously incredibly different cultures. Virgin Islands is mostly African American based culture, but they have Danish heritage, and there's, other West Indian influences there from other Caribbean islands. In Puerto Rico, we're obviously majority Hispanic, Latino. And in the CNMI, American Samoa, and Guam, they have a mixture of Chamorro and then Samoan, but also other cultures that are called Carolinian and, other Pacific Islander groups that, live in those territories, as well as other Asian groups that live there as well. And, the differences are really stark in terms of language, in terms of, race. But, there was an interesting way in which we just felt a huge amount of kinship, actually, and connection with them. So, at the end of the whole interaction, it kind of felt like we were family.
That's great. And it's interesting you kind of touched on it. And if you can expand a little bit on it, given the cultural differences and also where when each of these territories became territories of the United States. Can you, and also where we stand in Puerto Rico, given uh, the last four plebiscites where there's been a vote in favor of statehood, where are the rest of these territories in comparison to Puerto Rico when it comes to resolving its status? Could you elaborate a little bit on that? You touched on it a little bit, but
Definitely. So, it's really fascinating because, two of the territories, Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands and American Samoa, they actually became territories through a voluntary action of their own leadership, right? So they were former trust territories under the UN, meaning that after World War II, America essentially was granted by the UN the capacity to legally kind of, hold these jurisdictions as part of the UN trust territory. And in the case of some of the other places that were held, like Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, they actually decided to become independent countries, but maintain the relationship
Mhm.
with the United States through independence with free association. So they have their separate president, their separate
Constitution,
constitution, separate passport and
nationality.
everything. Yeah, exactly, right?
Mhm.
But in the case of American Samoa and in the case of the Northern Mariana Islands, their actual process of becoming U.S. territories was different. In American Samoa, there was literally a set of local chiefs for
Mm.
their local culture that came together and essentially decided that they wanted to cede their sovereignty to the United States in order to gain protection
Right.
from the United States militarily. And they actually have a form of government where there are collective land rights and other features that are basically very different from the common law legal and economic, framework that we think of in the rest of the 50 states. So, their process of becoming a territory was actually something voluntary by their own leaders.
That they were seeking for their own security purposes.
Exactly. And with an understanding and kind of exchange
Right.
of, what was being given and taken, right? Um, the big question for them is that in that process, they became put into a legal category of U.S. nationals, which means that they owe allegiance to the United States, but they actually aren't recognized as U.S.
Mhm.
citizens. So when people from American Samoa move to the United States mainland, which a lot of them have, they face a significant number of challenges and discrimination because, for example, they can't vote in elections. Like Puerto Rico
Right.
residents, when they move stateside, you can just register to vote and you're a U.S. citizen, so you're good to go. But American Samoans can't, right? They can't get the same types of jobs in public service that require United States citizenship, and they may not even be eligible for certain things like security clearances or other things that
Mhm.
require citizenship. And there's a portion of people on the island that really want that U.S. citizenship, and a lot of people who don't, and they're afraid that if they get that, then they might lose their culture or their capacity to hold land in the collective traditional ways that they've been holding for millennia.
Right. So, given the differences, and also that Puerto Rico, I would say one major difference is like at least this century in the last four plebiscites, Puerto Rico has definitively stated that they wish to become a state. Obviously it's still at the end of the day up to Congress. They have plenary power over this, over Puerto Rico's future status. But do you see the resolution of Puerto Rico status and the method that we resolve this through legislation and the ballot box as an example that these other territories can also use in the future as to decide their permanent status outside the territorial clause?
I think that the to go back to your previous question, which relates to this too, the other territories by and large are still figuring out some key elements in their own process of self-determination. Like, for example, the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, they have an actual, compact agreement that was negotiated between their leaders and
Right.
Congress and
And they
passed
actually
into
have
law.
some more federal benefits
Yep.
than Puerto Rico currently has.
Definitely. And in Guam, for example, they've actually tried to hold a plebiscite, but the plebiscite was actually blocked by a federal judge because they wanted to have provisions in it that would limit the capacity of people who weren't of Chamorro descent to actually participate in
Oh,
that.
that's very interesting.
And what ended up happening is that they had to cancel the plebiscite. So they've tried to move forward, but really been able to do
Right.
so in a way that honors what they want to keep for themselves. And in the case of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is fascinating to me, I found out that they're on their, I believe, 6th constitutional convention, which means that, as a territory, they're still operating under a federal law that was passed by Congress as their organic act and as their local constitution, but they haven't yet been able to locally agree to create a constitution so that Congress can then approve it. So they're still in that thought process. And, some of the things that they've been struggling with is, how to define, who is identified as the local people of the USVI. And so I think that in the case of Puerto Rico, we are definitely much further along in the debate. We're already at the point where the majority of island residents reject continuing under the current territory status. The majority of residents identify with one of the main non-territorial options, and we've been able to hold these votes on the island, and now have actively worked with Congress to begin defining a legislative framework which still has not become law but has advanced significantly, which would allow the U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico to vote on the constitutionally available options and then have those options be implemented. So whatever we end up doing with Puerto Rico inevitably will serve as one potential template and example for the other territories of what's feasible. Whether or not that actually meets their individual interests, their needs, and their unique histories, that's something that both those territories and the people who live there, as well as Congress, will have to determine.
They have to decide for themselves. And one thing that, given all these efforts and all the conversations that occurred at this summit, how do you see the Right to Democracy Coalition advancing the efforts to decolonize Puerto Rico and the other territories, or for the territories to resolve their political status in this Congress?
Well, you know what? I think that Right to Democracy and the Cross-Territorial Coalition is thinking on a basis that is more long-term. They're not necessarily constraining their thought process to the 2-year congressional cycles. In the pro-statehood movement, by and large, we have operated a lot more focused on Congress specifically and what can be done within the 2 years of each congressional cycle. What they're really trying to do is to actually ground their efforts in a more bottom-up, community-driven approach, where they're trying to build spaces of consensus for how decolonization and self-determination can actually be developed. And they're not just thinking about it exclusively in terms of legislation that needs to be passed, but other elements like, thinking about culture and community, and also how the different island territories are impacted by other things like, environmental change, or, the change in climate across the world, and obviously other issues that have to do with nutrition and food security. So it's a different approach. They're looking at it from a
Bottom up.
bottom up, but also from a kind of more holistic perspective.
Mhm.
which is great because it allows them to, talk about issues like education and how to engage with, artists and, creatives.
Mhm.
Talk about issues that, frankly, the statehood movement just doesn't talk about, like, indigenous rights and things like that. But at the same time, it also then limits the capacity to be as pointed when the opportunity comes to actually move things forward through the legislative process, which I think is one of the values that we bring to the processes of self-determination and decolonization, which is the statehood movement is very much focused on pushing the levers of the main institution that has the capacity to actually change the formal structure of territorial colonialism, which is, the U.S. Congress.
And that's a great segue, by the way, to our next issue, which is the upcoming summit, the Puerto Rico Equality and Statehood Summit of 2025, which is going to be hosted by the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration and the Governor of Puerto Rico, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. Could you tell us a little bit more about the event, George?
Yeah, so this is actually a really awesome event because the governor, when she ran last year, she put in her platform that she really wanted to have her administration, and particularly her D.C. office, the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Administration, become the home of the Puerto Rico statehood movement, and basically to help coordinate and lead efforts for the movement to effectively advocate in front of Congress. And they specifically promised to hold a Puerto Rico Equality and Statehood Summit on an annual basis. This particular event is going to be the first of this new annual events that are going to go happen going forward. And they're timed with the anniversary of the granting of U.S. citizenship to the people of Puerto Rico, which is on March 2nd. So the actual summit will take place on March 3rd and 4th, which is the 2 days immediately after that.
Yeah, and they're coming at a very busy time to DC, if I may say, because it's not just the anniversary, but it's also that same week that we're having State of the Union address.
Definitely.
So it's going to be a busy weekend and an important time for a lot of advocates from Puerto Rico to actually fly up here and meet with legislators that actually have a direct impact on the resolution of Puerto Rico's political status.
Definitely. And one of the other things that I think is super interesting about this is that the governor put forward in her platform this idea of taking a whole of government approach to addressing the advocacy efforts on behalf of the majority of voters on the island that have supported statehood, 4 times now. So she's not just coming by herself as the governor, she's also bringing other members of her cabinet and other agency heads. She's working together with leaders in the territorial legislature, both in the House and the Senate. I believe that there will be mayors that will also be coming in. And most importantly, she's essentially opened the doors for pro-statehood advocates and grassroots advocates, both on the island and stateside, to come and participate in this 2-day event. Now, their participation is not just going to be to come together and let's all cheer for statehood. We're actually going to have trainings, workshops, discussion panels to really kind of understand what's going on in Congress and how to be effective advocates there. And then a whole day that's focused on meeting with congressional offices, on meeting with members of Congress, on talking to congressional staff, and taking to them the data and the official certified results of what happened in that last plebiscite and that call to action of, hey, Congress, the people of Puerto Rico, voters in Puerto Rico, we've done our part. Now it's your turn to move this forward.
And I know that Governor Gonzalez Colon, this event's going to be huge to get advocates to come up here to speak to members. But I know that she's even active this week. I know she's here in D.C. She's met with Senator Martin Heinrich, who is the sponsor of the Puerto Rico Status Act. She's met with the new senator from Florida, and I believe she's also met with the White House because she's here for the National Governors Association.
Yep.
There's an event going on. But that shows that she's actively making status a priority. I've seen in some of the posts that she's posted that this is one of the reasons she is coming up here, and it's something that I hope will push Congress to finally moved this Congress in the 119th Congress to introduce a piece of legislation that provides that binding offer of statehood. And that's some of the efforts that we're trying to do, and obviously that advocates coming in March. And again, like I mentioned, it's a great time to come up here. Both the House and Senate are going to be in session. State of the Union. I look forward to it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what it boils down to is the view that the governor has been putting forward, which is one of really trying to represent the people of Puerto Rico, but also empower the people of Puerto Rico to actually, come and advocate for, what we believe and what we've chosen. So I think that that's a really, really powerful way to move this issue forward in front of Congress, where it's not just you coming as an official, but you're coming with citizen advocates, both from the island and from various states. So you can also appeal to members based on their own voters being at the table, telling them, hey, we're your voters and we care about this too.
Right. And that's another good segue. Basically, we want to start this new segment in our podcast. It's called Mailbag, where we go through several of the questions that have been submitted either through comments on our streaming channels or via email, and we kind of collect those questions, and we're going to try to answer some of the most asked questions. So we received a question in regards to sovereignty, and the issue was a lot of independent supporters claim that they support that because they think independence is the only means for Puerto Rico to achieve sovereignty. Can Puerto Rico achieve sovereignty through statehood?
Most definitely, right? So if you understand the word sovereignty, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily separate from the federal government. What sovereignty means is that you actually have the capacity to decide for yourself, where you have the power and the authority to decide for yourself. So states are sovereign under the U.S. Constitution. There is a dual sovereignty in the U.S. constitutional system, which is why all rights and powers that are not explicitly delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are reserved to the states and the people. And that's where that local sovereignty rests. So definitely, Puerto Rico can become a state and it can be sovereign.
Right. And the Supreme Court case that kind of defined what Puerto Rico's current status is, that it is not a dual sovereign, that Puerto Rico's entire sovereignty relies in Congress. And the territorial clause. Basically, that was Sanchez-Valles.
Yeah.
And a similar case occurred a few years after Sanchez-Valles in Alabama, where another person claimed double jeopardy. You can't charge me on the same crime because it's the same crime, and there's no dual sovereign. The Supreme Court said no. A state is a separate sovereign from the federal government. So again, a lot of independent supporters are trying to conflate sovereignty to mask their blatant, just straight support for independence, and also they deny the legal reality that a state is a sovereign. If you're a state, you have sovereignty. So it's similar to how independence supporters sometimes say that statehood is annexation. It's like, no, annexation happened 126 years ago. We're a possession of the United States. That's why they can impose the fiscal board, promesa, on Puerto Rico because it's a territory, it's a possession of the United States. You can't do that to a state.
Exactly, because they're sovereign.
Yeah.
So what else? What other questions we got, Martin?
So another question, is there currently a bill in Congress to decolonize Puerto Rico?
So unfortunately, not yet, but just wait. So in the last Congress, the Puerto Rico Status Act was reintroduced, and it got a huge amount of support in both the House with bipartisan support. I believe it's 102 co-sponsors, and we got 27 senators. Obviously, after every session of Congress, all of the bills that have not yet become law essentially are cease to operate. And then they must be reintroduced in the next session of Congress. So right now, the work that Governor Gonzalez Colón and us as members of the statehood movement are doing are to work with Congress to figure out, what piece of legislation has the best opportunity possible to advance this issue during this session of Congress. So ideally and hopefully in the next several weeks or in the next couple months, we'll see a new bill reintroduced, whether that be a new version of the past legislation or a completely different legislation. What matters most is that legislation be introduced that offers the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico an opportunity to make a final choice on their to end their territory status. And obviously, given the fact that statehood is the only non-territorial option that has gained the majority support, that it includes an offer of statehood for Puerto Rico.
Yeah, we want to make sure that we keep the gains that we've made so far with the Puerto Rico Status Act and see how we can move it forward this Congress, knowing the differences in the chambers and also some of the new members that sit in the committee's jurisdiction and also that represent Puerto Rico. But here's another question that is interesting. It goes a little bit towards some housing issues that have been occurring on the island. So the question that we received is, would statehood help alleviate gentrification on the island from the impacts of Act 60?
So first, I think it's really important just to talk about what Act 60 is. Act 60 is a set of federal local tax incentives that are granted to individuals that relocate from the states to Puerto Rico. And they basically allow those individuals moving from the states to Puerto Rico to pay a lower tax rate on the island. And since residents on the island are exempt from paying federal income taxes on their income derived on the island, there's a lot of very wealthy individuals that have decided to move to Puerto Rico basically to be able to avoid paying taxes. Now, these individuals are obviously going to be buying homes in premium places. So a lot of concern has come up by individuals and communities that these people are essentially, driving up the cost of housing and, buying kind of choice properties, particularly at a time where Puerto Rico is still kind of recovering economically from a significant period of distress after the fiscal crisis and the hurricanes and, everything else that has happened. But, to get back to the answer is, yes, statehood would significantly alleviate all potential gentrification happening as a result of these tax incentives under Act 60, because if Puerto Rico becomes a state, or when Puerto Rico becomes a state, everyone on the island will have equal rights and equal responsibilities, which means that no one will be able to move to Puerto Rico to avoid paying federal taxes.
Right. So it would cease to be the tax haven that, as some have claimed, that is causing a lot of this gentrification. And in fact, it might actually help a lot of Puerto Ricans that have left the island to come back to Puerto Rico because, the situation is better in Puerto Rico. Education, there's better funds.
You won't have a gap in the types of federal programs or benefits that are offered stateside, which make it better than what they are in Puerto Rico. So a lot of people will be able to return to the island. And, the other big thing about all of this is that you'll actually create an equal playing field economically so that Puerto Rico can more actively compete with other states and at the global level. And what that means is that there's going to be, more private sector investment and more economic opportunities, which is the best way to actually bring more people back to the island and to make sure that the people who want to stay are able to stay and don't feel forced to leave.
But basically, just to summarize, yes, statehood would end Act 60.
Well, in conclusion, we want to thank our audience and everyone for listening in. We greatly appreciate your participation in this conversation. And we highly encourage you to hit like, hit subscribe, hit follow. If you're listening on Apple, if you're listening on Spotify and YouTube, please check out the other channels. We're available across multiple different platforms. So whichever one's most convenient and favorable to you, please check that out. And also share this information on this podcast with your family and your friends. Let's help us grow this audience. And that way we can continue making a difference for the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico. Thank you so much.